I never thought my peaceful retirement as governor would end with an HOA leader trying to take my house of 50 years by tricking me. But when they ruined my late wife's special bench and tried to tear up my rose garden at 12 a.m., I had to wonder what would happen if they realized they messed with the wrong governor. Welcome, and please hit that subscribe button for more HOA stories. The knocking on my front door woke me up suddenly at 7 a.m. I was already worn out from the night before's budget meeting at the governor's building, but someone obviously had different ideas for my Sunday. When I opened the door, I saw Deborah Thompson, our new HOA president, standing there with a look of unhappiness on her face. "Governor Johnson, your roses are 3 inches over the allowed height," she said, holding up her measuring tape. "This is your 4th warning this month." I looked at my wife Mary's favorite rose garden, the one thing I'd promised to protect after she died from cancer last year. Every morning for 49 years, she took care of those roses while I drank my coffee nearby. Now they were supposedly breaking the rules. "Deborah," I said in a relaxed tone, "those roses have been here since 1972. The HOA wasn't even created until 1990. She adjusted her fancy sunglasses and handed me a piece of paper. "New rules were approved last month. You should come to the meetings if you want a voice in things. Being governor doesn't mean you're above the rules here." I held back a comment about how I'd missed the meeting because I was dealing with a state problem. Instead, I watched her walk across my yard, still holding her measuring tape, to bother Greg Miller about his mailbox color. Later that day, while looking through my mail, I found something odd. A letter addressed to current resident instead of my name. Inside was a paper saying I had 30 days to leave my house. My hands began to tremble. This had to be wrong. I called Greg immediately. He'd been my neighbor for 30 years and was on the first HOA board. "Hey, did you get any strange mail today?" "John, thank goodness you called," Greg said, sounding worried. "I just saw your house listed for sale online. It was posted this morning." My stomach felt like it fell. "That's not possible. I own this house completely." "Well, somebody believes otherwise. The real estate agent is Thompson Real Estate Group, Deborah Thompson." The clues started to make sense. Her constant nagging about the roses, the unexpected new rules, the notice to leave. This wasn't about garden rules at all. I spent the next hour looking through my home office for the first deed. When I finally found it in Mary's old files, another paper fell out. A handwritten note from her that I'd never seen. "My dearest John," it started, "if you're reading this, something has happened with the house. Look at the base of my rose garden, the 3rd bush from the left. I put copies of all our main papers there in a box that can't be damaged by water. You always made fun of me for being too careful with papers, but I thought we might need them one day." Even after she passed away, Mary was still guarding our home. I took a shovel and went to the garden, not worrying that I was still wearing my suit from yesterday's meetings. As I dug under her favorite peace rose, I heard Deborah's voice from next door. "Of course it's allowed," she was saying to someone on her phone. "The change to digital messed up some ownership records, and we're just fixing them. By the time anyone finds out, the sale will be done." She laughed. "Even the governor can't go against City Hall." My shovel hit something solid. Inside the metal box, I found what we needed. Our first deed, land surveys, and every HOA paper we'd ever signed, including one from 1990 that specifically protected our garden that was already there. I looked up to see Deborah watching me from across the fence. Her phone call stopped. For a moment, her confident look disappeared when she saw the box in my hands. Then, she turned and hurried toward her house, already calling another number. The sun was going down behind my home of 50 years, making long shadows through Mary's roses as I held our property papers. I understood this wasn't just about saving our house anymore. How many other homes had Deborah fixed during the change to digital? And more importantly, how did she not know that a governor might know something about looking into cheating? I picked up my phone and called Mark Smith, our state attorney. Mark, remember when you said you were looking for a strong case against real estate tricks? I think I found something interesting in my own yard. I heard Deborah's voice again, now yelling into her phone about urgent HOA meetings and destroying papers. But for the first time all day, I grinned. Mary had always said our small Victorian house had picked us for a reason. Maybe she was right. I couldn't sleep after finding that paper telling me to leave, so I went to my basement where I store all my important documents. My hands were shaking as I took out the old metal box Mary and I had purchased when we first moved in. Inside was our original deed from 1974. The paper yellowed, but still easy to read. Beside it were 50 years of property tax papers, each one carefully put away by my Mary. She was always the organized person. The sound of a car door closing made me look up through the basement window. A nice real estate agent's car had parked outside my house. My neighbor, Greg Miller, was running across his yard in his pajamas, trying to wave them away. I hurried upstairs and opened my front door, just in time to hear the agent say, "The open house is planned for this weekend." "There must be some mistake," I said, still holding my old deed. I never put my home up for sale. The agent looked confused and took out her tablet. According to the county records, this property was just listed by the Valley Creek HOA. She turned the screen toward me, and my heart almost stopped. There was my home, listed for $850,000 with pictures I'd never seen. I called my old friend Mark at the county records office right away. While I waited for him to check the files, I looked through more of my papers. That's when I found something odd. A notice from 6 months ago about the HOA updating their records. Deborah had talked a lot about not using paper anymore, saying it would make everything simpler. I hadn't paid much attention then. I was busy with a state budget problem. Greg came over with his laptop. He's good with computers, much better than me. Together we looked at the HOA's new online system. My stomach felt heavy when we found my property record. According to their system, I had given my deed to the HOA during the change to digital, but I had never signed anything like that. "Look at this," Greg said, pointing to his screen. He'd found 5 other homes in our area that had similar transfers, all belonging to people who'd lived here for a long time. All of them had received complaints from Deborah about their yards or paint colors in the past year. Just then, Mark called back. "Governor," he said, his voice serious, "something's wrong here. The digital deed has a signature date from 3 months ago, but according to my records, you were giving a speech in the Capitol that day. I'm watching the video now." My security team called next. They'd seen someone taking pictures of my house. When they went to check, the person said they were measuring for repair work ordered by the HOA. I hadn't approved any repairs. I was writing all this down when I got an email from Deborah. "Just wanted to remind you that the HOA has full power to keep up community standards. The buyers this weekend are a nice young couple. They know the importance of good lawn care, unlike some of our current people." The clues were starting to come together, and I didn't like what they showed. Deborah's real estate company handling all the HOA's moved properties, the sudden complaints about longtime residents, the mysterious change to digital. My years in politics had taught me how to spot a trick, and this had all the signs of one. A movement caught my eye through the window. More cars were pulling up outside. Through the growing darkness, I could see Deborah telling people with clipboards to go toward my front porch. She looked up, saw me watching, and gave me the same look she'd had at last week's HOA meeting when she'd complained about my roses. My phone buzzed. A text from Susan Williams, the HOA secretary. "Governor, please check your email. There's something you need to see about the records transfer, but don't let Deborah know I sent it." The urgent HOA meeting was full of worried neighbors. When I walked in, I wasn't wearing my usual suit and tie. I came in my gardening clothes, dirt still fresh on my knees from checking on Mary's roses one last time. Deborah's face turned red, seeing me dressed so casually. She always hated how I kept working in my garden, even after becoming governor. I sat in the front row, placing my old leather bag on the floor. Inside was every piece of paper showing I owned my home since 1973. My neighbor Greg sat next to me, squeezing my shoulder to support me. The room buzzed with whispers. Nobody had ever seen an urgent meeting called so quickly. Deborah stood at the front, wearing her fancy red jacket, tapping her nails on the wood. "Governor Johnson," she said, saying my title like it was something bad. "I guess you're here to talk about the property problem." She smiled, that fake smile I'd seen too many times when she complained about my garden hose being visible. "You could say that," I replied, keeping my voice calm, like Mary taught me during my first campaign. "I'm here because you're trying to sell my home without my okay." The room became so quiet, you could hear the air conditioner. Deborah's smile grew bigger, more dangerous. She took out a big stack of papers from her fancy bag. "Actually, according to our new digital record system, you haven't owned that property since last year's update." I stood up slowly, my knees making a noise. "Deborah, I've lived in that house for 50 years. I have every paper since 1973 right here," I said, touching my bag. "You can't just type something into a computer and make my home yours to sell." "Oh, but I can," she said, waving her papers around. "See, when we updated our systems, we found several problems. Your property wasn't properly signed up under the new HOA rules, so ownership has gone to the group." The neighbors started talking. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street stood up. "That's silly. J.S. has lived there longer than anyone." Deborah hit her gavel. "The rules are the rules. If you don't properly sign up your property during a system update, you lose your rights. It's all in Section 47B of the new rules." That's when I smiled, reaching into my bag. "Interesting you mention those new rules, Deborah. I have here the first HOA agreement from 1980. It clearly says that any changes to signing up rules must be approved by a 75% vote of homeowners." I took out another paper. "And look what I found in the county records. No such vote ever happened." Deborah's face went pale. She looked through her papers faster. That's not important. The change to digital is more important than the—" "Law?" came a deep voice from the back. Mark Smith, my old friend and state attorney, stood up. "Because I'd be very interested in hearing how a computer system is more important than 50 years of legal property records." Deborah's hands started shaking. "This meeting is over!" She grabbed her papers, but in her rush, one fell to the ground. Greg picked it up before she could grab it back. "Hey, this is a sale agreement dated 3 months ago." Greg's voice rose in shock. "You've been trying to sell John's house since January." The room exploded. Deborah backed away from the front as neighbors started yelling questions. Through the noise, I watched her take out her phone, fingers moving quickly over the screen. Later, we'd find out she was deleting emails, but she didn't know about the backups Susan had already saved. "Deborah," I said, my voice cutting through the noise, "I think you should know I just signed a special order this morning, creating a state group on housing tricks. Would you like to guess who's leading it?" She ran for the door, her shoes clicking on the floor, but Mark was faster, and 2 police officers were already waiting in the entrance. I saw her fancy bag fall to the floor, spilling more papers that would lead us down a path none of us expected. Greg picked up the gavel Deborah had left behind. I move for a quick vote to remove Deborah Thompson as HOA president. All in favor? Every hand in the room went up, but somehow I knew this was just the start. I sat in my study, looking at the walls of proof we'd collected against Deborah. Something wasn't making sense. The paper trail was too messy for someone as careful as her. That's when Susan Thompson, Our HOA secretary of 15 years knocked on my door with tears in her eyes and a USB drive in her shaking hands. "Governor Johnson, I can't sleep at night anymore," she whispered, closing the door behind her. "Deborah didn't just go after your home. There's so much more." My security team checked the USB drive before I plugged it into my computer. What we found made my blood run cold. Lists, property records, fake papers, all carefully organized by date and neighborhood. Deborah hadn't just changed my property records. She'd been slowly taking over homes throughout the whole county. I called Greg Miller, who lived next door to 3 empty houses Deborah's company had recently taken. He came over right away, bringing his daughter, Sarah, a data expert who'd been wondering about the neighborhood's property records for months. "Look at this pattern," Sarah said, pointing to her laptop screen. "Every target is either old, too busy with work to notice the paper changes, or living out of state. Deborah's company comes in, says there are HOA problems, then suddenly finds ownership issues." Susan's hands trembled as she showed more files. "I started keeping records when she first joined the HOA board 5 years ago. At first it was just odd things, changing meeting notes, losing complaint forms from certain homeowners. Then I noticed property papers going missing from our files." Greg paced my study, his face getting redder. "Remember the Andersons? Lived here for 40 years. Deborah said they'd agreed to sell their house because of HOA problems. They moved to Florida last year, heartbroken." I picked up my phone, but Susan grabbed my arm. "Wait, there's more. Deborah has a whole group. Real estate agents, workers, even someone at the county records office. They're all in on it." Sarah showed another paper that made my heart stop. A list of future targets, 30 more homes in our area alone. Next to each address were notes about the owner's weaknesses. Next to my name, it said, "Too busy with state duties to notice changes. Wife passed away. Strong feelings about the property make proper legal review unlikely." They'd been watching us, learning our weak points, using our lives against us. I thought about my rose garden, the one Mary had helped me plant when we first moved in. Deborah hadn't targeted it because it broke HOA rules. She targeted it because she knew it would distract me with sadness and anger while she worked on taking my home. Susan showed us emails revealing Deborah's next move. She planned to show proof at next week's HOA meeting that several more people had failed to properly move their deeds during the change to digital. It would look like a simple mistake that just needed to be fixed. "The thing is," Sarah said, pointing to her screen, "I checked the first county records. None of these ownership changes ever went through proper legal steps. Deborah's been creating fake paperwork that looks real but isn't properly signed up. She's hoping no one checks the real county records." As we looked deeper, Greg noticed something strange about the dates. Every property takeover attempt happened during big state events, when I'd be too busy to pay attention to neighborhood drama. I sat back in my chair, finally understanding Deborah's full plan. She hadn't just been taking homes. She'd been creating a kingdom right under our noses, using our trust in the HOA system against us. The question wasn't just about saving my home anymore. It was about stopping her before she ruined our whole community. Susan stood up straighter, her fear turning to anger. "I have copies of everything, Governor. Every email, every fake paper, every secret meeting recording. I've been saving them for years, waiting for someone strong enough to take her down." I looked at the faces around me. Susan's determination, Greg's anger, Sarah's focus. Deborah might have money and connections, but we had truth and community on our side. And she was about to learn that messing with people's homes was a risky game, especially when one of those people had the full power of the governor's office behind them. Sarah's laptop made a noise with a new alert. Deborah had just called an urgent HOA meeting for tomorrow night. We looked at each other, knowing this was it. The time for collecting proof was over. Now we had to decide. Did we set our trap, or was Deborah about to set hers? I was just getting ready for bed when my phone buzzed. It was Greg, his voice shaking. "They're here with bulldozers." I rushed to my window and saw the yellow machines moving up my street like giant monsters in the dark. My security team was already moving, their flashlights cutting through the night as they surrounded 3 men in work gear. "The HOA president gave us permission," one worker claimed, waving a document that seemed official, but I knew it was fake. I'd been signing official papers as governor for years. Even from my window, I could tell this one wasn't real. My hands were shaking as I called the police, but my voice stayed steady. I'd learned that trick from years of handling state problems. While waiting, I opened my laptop and started live streaming everything from my security cameras. If Deborah wanted to play unfairly, she'd have to do it with the whole internet watching. The police arrived quickly, their sirens silent but lights flashing. Officer Rodriguez, who'd grown up in this area, took one look at the paperwork and shook his head. "This authorization is dated for next week," he said, holding back a smile. Deborah hadn't even checked the dates when she faked it. I thought that would be the end, but I was wrong. The next morning, while my security team changed shifts, something caught my eye through the kitchen window. Deborah was standing by Mary's memorial bench, phone in hand, talking to someone. Before I could get outside, she was gone. But what she left behind hurt me more than any bulldozer could. Mary's beautiful bench, where she used to read stories to our grandkids, was in pieces. The metal sign with her name was gone. Our favorite saying about love and roses was scratched out. 50 years of memories were broken, like the marble pieces spread across my lawn. I heard Greg's back door slam. He was already running over with his phone out, recording everything. Susan from across the street joined us, crying when she saw the damage. "I got it all on my security camera," she said, showing the video on her phone. "Deborah did this herself, not even an hour ago." But then Susan gasped, zooming in on her screen. In the background of her video, barely visible behind Deborah's shoulder, was a man I knew. The same developer who'd been trying to buy up the whole block for years. They were both looking at papers, pointing at different houses on our street. My security team found 3 more hidden cameras installed around my property, all connected to an unknown address. Deborah hadn't just been bothering me. She'd been studying my schedule, learning when the house was least protected. I sat in my garden, surrounded by the pieces of Mary's bench, and felt something change inside me. Deborah didn't know about the hidden camera in Mary's old birdhouse, the one I'd never had the heart to take down, or about the tracking device my security team had quietly put on her car after the first threats started, or that her phone had been automatically connecting to my property's guest Wi-Fi, logging every visit. As I picked up pieces of marble, my phone lit up with messages from neighbors sharing their own security videos. Deborah had been busy last night, putting condemned notices on every house owned by someone over 60. But she'd made a big mistake. The notices used the official state seal. My seal. I looked at the broken pieces of Mary's bench, remembering how she always said everything happens for a reason. Maybe she was right. Deborah thought she was destroying proof. Instead, she'd given me exactly what I needed to stop her. Proof she was pretending to be a state official. That evening, as I watched the sunset turn my roses gold, my phone buzzed with an alert from my security system. Deborah was back, this time with a whole team of people in suits. But when she saw the state police cars parked quietly along the street, her face changed. She finally understood what her selfishness had done. She hadn't just picked a fight with an old man who loved his garden. She declared war on a governor who knew how to fight back. The morning started with sirens, not the usual kind that came with my security team, but the loud ones that meant trouble. I was drinking my morning coffee when 3 state police cars pulled up to Deborah's house across the street. My neighbor Greg ran over, still in his bathrobe, nearly spilling his own coffee. "You won't believe what Susan just sent me," he said, holding up his phone. The HOA's money records were shown on the screen, showing money transfers to accounts in other countries. Deborah hadn't just been taking homes, she'd been running a full criminal operation. I watched from my porch as Deborah came out, still wearing her fancy pajamas and that pearl necklace she always showed off. Even now, she held her head high, like she owned the whole neighborhood. The officers read her rights while she stood there, hands cuffed behind her back, her perfect hair getting messy in the morning breeze. "This is silly," she yelled, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Do you know who I am? I'm friends with Senator Parker." That made me laugh. Parker had lost his seat last year after his own problem. Neighbors started coming out of their houses, some still in bathrobes, others dressed for work but too curious to leave. Mrs. Johnson from number 42 brought out her phone, recording everything. Her hands were shaking. Deborah had threatened to fine her last month for having a wheelchair ramp that was an eyesore. The state investigator, Agent Rodriguez, walked over to update me. 3 counties, 17 neighborhoods, and over 40 homes targeted, all following the same pattern. Digital records mysteriously changed, sudden eviction notices, quick sales to Deborah's real estate company, and big profits from selling the properties quickly. Agent Rodriguez said, handing me a thick folder. "Your home wasn't the first, but it'll be the last. We found proof going back 5 years. Some victims lost everything." A news van pulled up, then another. Deborah saw them and suddenly changed her story. "Governor Johnson planned this whole thing," she screamed, makeup running down her face. "He's trying to make me look bad before the election. Ask him about the payments." I stayed on my porch, calm, drinking my coffee. The reporters looked at me, then at Deborah being put into a police car, then back at me. They knew who to believe. 20 years in public service had taught me one thing. The truth always comes out. Susan arrived, carrying boxes of papers. She looked tired, but proud. "I've been collecting proof for months," she told the officers. "Every fake paper, every changed record, every illegal sale." Deborah thought nobody would notice because she only targeted older residents who might not check their digital records. More police cars arrived. They were heading to Deborah's real estate office downtown. Greg squeezed my shoulder. "Mary would be proud," he said quietly. "Remember how she always said your determination would save the day someday?" The investigation was spreading quickly. By noon, we learned Deborah's company had connections to similar tricks in 2 other states. The FBI was getting involved. My phone kept ringing with calls from other governors, senators, even the Attorney General. Deborah's last words before the police car door closed were about my upcoming re-election campaign. She thought this was all about politics. She never understood that some things matter more than power, like home, community, and doing what's right. I looked at my rose garden, at Mary's broken memorial bench, at our home of 50 years. A young reporter approached, microphone ready, asking about my campaign plans. I smiled, thinking about the retirement papers sitting unsigned on my desk at the Capitol. Deborah had assumed I was fighting to keep my position as governor, but as I watched her being driven away, I realized this was never about staying in power. The real question was, how many other Deborahs were out there, thinking they could take advantage of good people just trying to live peacefully in their homes? Tomorrow, I would make my big announcement at the Capitol. But today, I had some roses to take care of and a memorial bench to fix. The morning sun touched my face as I knelt in my rose garden, carefully planting a new Mary's Love rose bush. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but each flower I planted felt like a small win. Greg Miller, my neighbor of 30 years, walked over with 2 hot cups of coffee. "Never thought I'd see the day Deborah Thompson would end up in jail," Greg said, handing me a cup. "The news is calling it the biggest real estate trick in state history. I smiled, remembering how this all started with one simple rose garden problem. The media trucks had finally left my driveway yesterday, after staying for 3 weeks straight. Turns out people love stories about dishonest HOA presidents trying to take the governor's house. Susan Thompson joined us, carrying a thick folder. As our new HOA president, she'd been working hard to fix the mess Deborah left behind. "You won't believe what we found in the old records," she said, sitting on Mary's new memorial bench. Deborah tried the same trick in 3 other neighborhoods before moving here. She'd target older residents, mess with property records during tech changes, then force quick sales through her company. My security person, Mike, walked up with his morning update. "Sir, we found 28 more victims across the state. The FBI is involved now." He paused, then added, "And Mrs. Thompson's trying to make a deal with the lawyers." I shook my head, remembering Deborah's face when they arrested her. She'd screamed about made-up stories and threatened to reveal my dishonest administration. What she never understood was that I'd spent my whole career fighting people like her. People who thought rules didn't apply to them. The neighborhood kids rode by on their bikes, waving at Governor Bill as they passed. One of them, little Annie from 2 doors down, stopped to give me a hand-drawn card. Inside was a picture of my rose garden with the words "Our Hero" written in crayon. My phone buzzed. Another message from the state attorney general. They wanted me to speak at Deborah's trial next month. I thought about saying no, about just enjoying my retirement in peace. But then I looked at Mary's bench, remembered how Deborah's people had broken the first one, and knew I had to see this through. Greg helped me up, my knees making noise in protest. "You know what Mary would say about all this?" he asked with a knowing smile. "She'd laugh," I replied, touching the smooth wood of her new bench. "Then she'd tell me to stop worrying and plant more roses." Susan spread out some papers on the bench. "Look at these new HOA rules we've created. Full digital openness, triple checking for property record changes, and required resident voting on big decisions." She pointed to a specific part. "We're calling it the Johnson Rule." I felt tears coming, but blinked them away. Mary always said crying was just the heart's way of watering hope. And right now, hope was growing all over our neighborhood. Families who'd lost their homes to Deborah's trick were moving back in. The community was getting better. As the morning went on, more neighbors stopped by. Each had a story about Deborah's meanness, about feeling powerless against her plans. But now, they also had stories of winning, of fairness, of community coming together. My rose garden had become a symbol of standing up to bad behavior, one flower at a time. I looked at my home of 50 years, its Victorian beauty unchanged despite Deborah's best efforts to take it away. Sometimes the biggest fights start in the smallest places: a garden, a bench, a home. And sometimes just refusing to give up can change everything. Standing there with my neighbors, watching the roses catch the morning light, I understood this wasn't just about saving my house anymore. It was about guarding the places and people we love, about standing up to bullies who think they're above the law. I picked up my gardening tools, ready to plant another rose bush. After all, I had a lot more flowers to plant and a community to rebuild.